Hello, Dumelang. Welcome back. Sure. So I feel like the things I've been speaking about have been um, deeply reflective and perhaps evocative and maybe even provocative. However, the point of these conversations is to really get us thinking and feeling. Now, I want to go back to how I ended the last episode. I ended with a question about silence, about what silence might be protecting. And underneath that question was another one, a question about safety. Because if silence is protecting something, perhaps it is also protecting us, protecting relationships, protecting comfort, protecting belonging, protecting our sense of ourselves, protecting us from conflict, from even harm, protecting us from exposure. And so I've been sitting with this idea: what happens when we stop being silent? What happens when race finally enters language? What happens when somebody says the thing everyone has been quietly feeling, but nobody has been saying out loud? I think many of us have experienced that moment when race moves from being present to being spoken. And I've been wondering, what exactly happens when something that has been carried silently finally becomes language? I've been wondering whether speaking does something more than just communicate, whether naming something actually changes our relationship to it. Think about it. They are experiences we carry for years, experiences we feel, experiences we know, experiences that shape us, and yet somehow they remain difficult to put into words. Sometimes the experience arrives long before the language or the words. Have you ever known something before you could explain it? Have you ever felt something deeply but struggled to find words for it? I think many of us have. And perhaps that is why naming matters, because language does not only describe reality, sometimes it reveals reality. It makes visible something that was already there, not creating it, but revealing it. And I think conversations about race often operate this way. People sometimes speak as though race only becomes significant when somebody mentions it. That's not true. Race was already present. The experience was already present. The tension was already present. The history was already there. Naming it simply makes it harder to ignore. And perhaps that is part of what can feel uncomfortable or unsettling. Not that something new has appeared or has happened, but that something previously unseen has become visible. So sometimes I wonder whether we are reacting to race itself or whether we are reacting to what race awakens in us. Memory, pain, shame, loss, anger, grief, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being blamed, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of hearing something that challenges how we understand ourselves. Have you ever noticed how quickly conversations about race become emotional? Even when everyone is speaking calmly, nobody's shouting, nobody's fighting, and yet the emotional temperature in the room has completely changed. The emotions were often already there, so race simply gave them somewhere to gather. Perhaps that is part of what makes race feel so charged. It brings us into contact, direct contact, with things that are bigger than the conversation itself. History enters the room. Family stories enter the room. Old wounds enter the room. Experiences we thought we had moved beyond sometimes enter the room. The communities that shaped us enter the room. The ways we were taught to understand ourselves enter the room. And perhaps in ways we don't always recognize, our ancestors entered the room too. The people whose lives made our lives possible, the people whose struggles, sacrifices, silences, and survival live on in us. Now, whether we understand that spiritually, psychologically, culturally, or historically, I think very few of us arrive alone. We bring entire worlds with us. And perhaps that is why these conversations can feel so much bigger than the people sitting in the room. But something else can happen too. Relief. I don't think we speak enough about that. Sometimes there is relief when race is finally named. Relief that somebody finally said it. Relief that we no longer have to pretend. That an experience we have been carrying privately has finally entered reality. Have you ever felt that? That moment when somebody says something and you find yourself thinking, yes, that's exactly it. Not because you agree with every word, but because something important has finally become visible. I think visibility can feel deeply, deeply relieving, especially when you've spent a long time feeling unseen, or when you've been carrying an experience and wondering whether anybody else could see it too. Sometimes naming something doesn't create division. Sometimes it creates recognition, or it creates a moment of profound human contact. A moment where you realize, oh, I'm not the only one carrying this. I think one of the hardest things about race is not always the experience itself, but it's carrying the experience alone, carrying something that feels significant to you, but invisible to everyone else. Have you ever had an experience that changed something inside you, but felt impossible to explain? Not only race, any experience, any moment where language feels too small. I think many people know that loneliness, the loneliness of knowing and not knowing how to communicate what you know, right? Knowing something, but not knowing how to communicate to that knowing. The loneliness of wondering, will they understand? Will they believe me? Will this make sense to anyone else? And perhaps that is one reason these conversations matter. Not because they solve everything, but because they make it possible to feel less alone. To discover that something we thought belonged only to us or to ourselves is actually shared by others too. Naming something always changes your relationship to it. Once something enters language, it becomes real in a different way, which is why speaking can feel risky. Not because we suddenly create a problem, but because we can no longer pretend the problem isn't there. And I think we know that tension. The tension between preserving comfort and preserving truth. Have you stayed silent to keep the peace? Have you ever spoken knowing it might change the atmosphere completely? Have you ever left a conversation wondering whether honesty was worth the cost? Or found yourself speaking more carefully than you wanted to because you could already feel consequences approaching? I think many of us have, and perhaps that is why courage is often so required. Not because we know exactly what will happen, but because we don't. Or sometimes we do know because of previous experiences. But maybe often we don't know what will happen. One of the things I've come to appreciate is that conversations about race are rarely, very rarely, only about race. They are about difference and what we do with difference. They are about recognition and misrecognition. They are about belonging and history and vulnerability. They reveal something fundamental about human beings. Our desire for connection, our desire to be seen, and our fear of being seen. There's usually that tension, right? The desire to be seen and then the fear of being seen. Our longing to be understood and our difficulty understanding one another, especially when there's difference. Perhaps this is why these conversations matter. Not because they are easy, not because they are comfortable, but because they reveal something about what it means to be human together. Have you ever noticed how often race conversations eventually become conversations about relationships, about connection, about how we see one another, how we misunderstand one another, how we protect ourselves from one another, and how sometimes, despite everything, we still find moments of connection. Now, as I bring these reflections on race to a pause, I find myself returning to silence one more time. Maybe silence is not only absence. Maybe silence points us toward what still needs attention, what still needs language, what still needs witnessing, and what still needs courage. So perhaps the work is not to eliminate silence completely, but to become curious about it, to listen beneath it, to ask, what is it protecting? What it might be asking of us. Over the last few episodes, I reflected briefly on race, blackness, identity, and silence. Not because I have the answers, but because these are realities that have shaped my life, my work, and my way of understanding the world. And perhaps as I've reflected on race over these last few episodes, another question has been quietly emerging for me. A question that sits alongside race. And that's a question about culture. Because when we speak about blackness, we often find ourselves speaking about oppression. We speak about exclusion or inequality or what has been taken. And those conversations matter. But I wonder if there's another question we need to ask. Not only what happened to us, but also what remains. What survived? What was carried forward? What continues to live in us despite everything? Because perhaps decolonizing experiences of blackness is not only about resisting definitions of who we are that were imposed on us, perhaps it is also about remembering ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of relating, ways of belonging. These are the things that coloniality could not fully erase. And that is the conversation I want to begin next. More specifically, what has happened to our culture as Black Africans? What have we carried forward? What have we lost? What have we forgotten? And what might we need to remember? But before we leave this conversation on race, I want to leave a few questions behind. Questions that I suspect I will keep returning to. Questions that perhaps we will return to together. And that is, what do we actually mean when we speak about race work? What makes race work possible? What gets in the way? Who carries responsibility for that work? Is it the responsibility of individuals, communities, institutions, a particular race group? Or is it all of us? And what might mutual race work look like? Not race work that belongs to one group, not race work that asks some people to teach while others simply observe, but race work that emerges from our shared humanity, while still taking our different histories seriously, because we do have different histories. Now, as I'm sure you've come to realize by now, I don't have answers to these big, complex questions. I am merely stating them out loud and hoping we can all think together. And I think all of these questions are worth carrying. And these are questions worth living with, returning to. So this is not the end of the conversation on race. Perhaps it is simply a pause, a place to gather our thoughts before we continue the journey. And I will see you on the next one. Thank you for listening, for reflecting with me. Lesedi Khanya. I'll see you on the next one.